of powerful storms sends waves of floodwater across a fertile valley.
It'll fill the rivers too high and it'll wallop us.
250 miles turned into an inland sea.
And there would just be unbelievable series of personal tragedies as people are impacted.
Torrents of water pouring into crowded neighborhoods.
Our house would be washed away.
Tens of thousands of people lose everything.
Floods like this change the course of history.
It happened in New Orleans, and it could happen again in Sacramento if its levees are breached. Sacramento. It's California's state capital and home to over 400,000 people. It's the economic and cultural hub of an entire region.
I enjoy living here. Everything that I feel I need in life is here.
But this beautiful state capital has one major problem. It sits on a massive floodplain, California's Central Valley.
The Central Valley has been referred to as the Inland Sea because historically it flooded over an area more than 200 miles long by 40 miles wide.
And Sacramento itself was built right at the convergence of two major rivers, the Sacramento and the American, which tend to flood almost every year. What keeps this city from being washed away is the 100 miles of levees throughout the city, built to control the rivers and hold back the annual floods. They are man-made earthen embankments raised on both sides of the river, anywhere from a few feet to 30 feet above the natural height of the riverbank. But scientists worry that one day, these levees will break and thousands of tons of water will come crashing through Sacramento.
I can say this with absolute confidence that we will see levee failures in this system.
The people in Sacramento should prepare for the fact of a flood. Not if, but when.
Central Valley residents did survive flooding in 1986 and 1997, but they've never seen anything like the deadly disaster that awaits them. And the effects of this catastrophe would reach far beyond the city of Sacramento, across the entire nation.
A major flood will eventually come to this system, and the whole country will feel it, because it's coming to the 5th largest economy in the world, which is California, and it's coming to the state capital of the 5th largest economy in the world.
A flood could impact the Central Valley's $20 billion agricultural industry by flooding fields and blocking Interstates 5 and 80, the state's main transportation corridors. And since California produces over half the nation's fruits and vegetables, that could have a disastrous effect on supermarkets across the U.S. To see what devastation catastrophic levee breaks can inflict, Sacramento residents need only look to a southern sister city. New Orleans is world-renowned for its jazz, its jambalaya, and now for Hurricane Katrina and the ensuing tragedy that hit the city in 2005. Like Sacramento's rivers, New Orleans canals are bordered by levees. But in August of 2005, New Orleans levees are put to the ultimate test.
We knew that the levees were inadequate. We knew we were not going to get funding to improve them. Well, I mean, people threw up their hands and said, okay, we're not getting the funding, so we're going to get flooded.
No one knew just how flooded. As Hurricane Katrina heads straight for the Gulf Coast, 1.2 million New Orleans residents heed the warning to evacuate. But local tour operator Sidney Smith decides to weather the storm.
I've lived in New Orleans my entire life. I've lived through numerous hurricanes. I've never evacuated, and I didn't intend to evacuate for this one.
In the early hours of Monday morning, Hurricane Katrina makes landfall in Louisiana.
The wind was blowing heavily and howling, and trees were flying down, and stop signs were blowing over, and stop lights, and roofs were getting damaged, and it was pretty noisy.
Water accumulates inside the industrial canal, which connects Lake Pontchartrain to the Mississippi River. It begins to spill over the top of the levee. This causes a section of the levee wall along the lower 9th Ward to collapse, and the water comes crashing through.
It then poured into the city and poured into the 9th Ward.
The rushing waters open up a huge gap in the levee
And just swept the homes and automobiles and trees in its path out of the way, something like a tsunami.
More levees begin to cave as water levels rise in canals all across the city. Even once the storm is past, water continues to gush into sections of New Orleans.
By Monday evening, which would be about 15 hours after the first breaches occurred, the city had flooded to about 80% of the area.
But Sydney is unaware of the extent of the horror that's occurring in the rest of the city. As of now, his neighborhood remains untouched by the flood.
We all went to bed on Monday night thinking we had dodged the bullet.
But Sydney would soon awaken to a shocking scene.
On Tuesday morning, we woke up to find that my street had become a river, my front yard had become a lake, and water was creeping into my home.
By now, at least 7 levee breaks have occurred in New Orleans, and over 10 feet of water covers huge sections of the city. At this point, the water is so deep that evacuating by foot or car is impossible, and the water has become putrid.
There was vomit in this water, there were feces, there were dead animals, there was urine. And this was all over the city. And this is the kind of water that was coming into my home. It was brown, it was toxic. It was a toxic soup.
Sydney realizes the water is rapidly rising.
By Tuesday night, I had a good 4 feet of toxic soup in my house. And from what I've heard since then, in fact, what I know is that hundreds and hundreds or thousands of people had their entire homes covered with this toxic soup.
Surrounded by fetid floodwater, Sydney becomes a prisoner in his own home. Helicopters airdrop meal packages in the water, and Sydney has no choice but to wade through the muck in order to eat.
I was in that water just cursing the ground that I was walking on. You know, this is a real case of survival here.
Meanwhile, flood refugees from around the city pack into the Superdome and the Convention Center, creating a humanitarian crisis. As residents throughout the city fight to survive, Sydney endures 3 more days in his inundated home. Finally, a hurricane survivor with a boat rescues Sydney. They head for high ground.
We were sailing over houses, we were sailing over stop signs and bus stops, we were sailing over cars, we were sailing past dead animals floating in the water. It was an ugly experience.
Sydney eventually makes his way to the airport and escapes the flooded city, with one big question nagging at him.
I have to ask the powers that be who warned us why they didn't improve the levee system.
He lost most of his possessions, but his house was salvaged. Thousands of New Orleanians weren't so lucky. They lost everything, including their homes. And much of the city itself was left in ruins.
And it may be decades before we can get back to something like the city's condition before Katrina, if ever.
The world now knows the immense suffering a deficient levee system can cause.
New Orleans was dependent entirely on the strength of their levees and the hoped for fact that maybe the hurricanes will miss. Well, in this case, they didn't.
Today, experts are raising the same red flag over another American city laced with levees.
The Sacramento area is now, I think, the worst case for a major flood that would devastate a city and pose a threat to the population.
Up next, California's Central Valley could become an inland sea if levees collapse and the rivers reclaim the capital city. If multiple levees crumble on the Sacramento and American rivers, California's capital could turn into a watery hell.
If we got a large flood that resulted in lots of levees failing around the communities here in Sacramento, it would be a catastrophic event.
I do know that this particular area here will be under about 15 to 20 feet of water.
I think the effect would be devastating.
Especially after what happened in New Orleans, you have to think about it because otherwise, you know, you're just going to be surprised.
Every winter, the mountain ranges of California accumulate about 200 inches of snow.
What happens first is that there's a lot of snow that piles up on the mountains.
An especially deep snowpack can contain up to 16 million tons of frozen water. The Sacramento area is also hit every winter with warm subtropical storms that blow in from Hawaii, called the Pineapple Express.
As we move into the Pineapple Express season, starting in mid-December on through February, we roll the dice every year.
When the Pineapple Express arrives, it unleashes not just one storm, but a series of them, typically dumping over 1 foot of rainfall.
And they'll come wave after wave, say every 12 hours to 36 hours.
It is this combination of a huge accumulation of snow and these warm storms that create the problem. As the storms douse the snowpack in the mountains with warm rain, the snow melts very fast, sending millions of tons of water into the mountain streams. These streams feed into the Sacramento and American rivers, which flow directly into the valley.
And of course, the watersheds can't shed their water fast enough to recover.
The rivers become bloated, causing water to pour over the top of the levee.
Once that water starts pouring over the top, it has to cascade, say, 15, 20, in some cases 30 feet down the face of the interior of the levee. It just carves a hole in the levee right away.
Overfilled rivers create another way levees can fail: under seepage.
Water, even if it doesn't go to the top of the levee, can cause seepage problems, either through the levee itself or underneath the levee in the foundation.
If it starts flowing fast enough, it actually starts eroding the levee on the inside.
As the interior of the levee is washed away, the top begins to sag, water dumps over, and a massive gap quickly forms.
Its erosive power is immense, and it'll just unravel the levee. At that point, the hole in the levee will expand to the size of a football field in a matter of hours.
And just as suddenly, over 200,000 people will be sent scrambling to escape the flood. "100 inches of rainfall is frozen in the Sierra Nevada mountains east of Sacramento. Then suddenly the Pineapple Express, up to 2 feet of warm rain across days.
It will rain over the American River watershed. It may rain also over the Sacramento River watershed, and we will start getting massive amounts of water down those two rivers.
In Sacramento, families like Jim and Larkin Penrose are ready at any moment to flee if necessary.
Our evacuation plans are once a breach has occurred or once we're notified that there's an imminent problem, we'll be leaving.
But they and everyone else in Sacramento may not get the word to evacuate until it's too late. After the rivers have risen too high and the levees have reached their breaking point, boils appear on the dry side of the levee as water seeps through, and suddenly...
And the levee will sag and collapse, and then the water rushes over the top, and then it's chaos. It's a matter of minutes that the change starts to occur.
A large chunk of the levee bursts out into the neighborhood with unstoppable force.
It would take out the immediate homes next to the levee and then start filling the basin.
It's one of the most powerful forces in nature. It will carry away everything. Buildings, cars, the works. Nothing can stop it.
It is impossible to try to leave.
Within the first hour, we'd have over a foot of water.
Enough to float a car.
We have very little time between when it starts to rain intensively and then the flood arrives.
The rising water paralyzes the entire city.
More and more of our roads will start being impassable. Eventually, as things go up, we could lose lots of major freeways.
Meanwhile, as the water surges into the Penrose's house, they have only one option.
We would initially just move up to the second story.
If this area was flooded, the potential depths could reach between 6 and 15 feet commonly throughout this area, and in some areas even greater than 15 feet.
Which means the second story may not be high enough.
The flooding could get above that. If it does, we have provisions to go up to the roof.
Meanwhile, murky waters overrun the rest of the city.
Our airport could be under 13 feet of water. Our capital could be under perhaps 3 to 7 feet.
There could be tens of thousands of homes flooded, essentially over $12 billion of direct damage.
And if the water rises to roof level, the Penroses would be driven to their last resort.
This is the raft we would use if we had to abandon our home and get to higher ground.
Thousands of people battling a toxic tide of floodwater, about to lose everything, maybe even their lives.
There would be such a large dislocation of people in the economy, and there would just be unbelievable series of personal tragedies as people are impacted.
The suffering is so intense for these people, they can't put a monetary value on it.
The Central Valley slowly drowns as raging floodwaters rediscover their natural floodplain.
We could be looking at an area of more than 100 miles long by 20 miles wide that could be flooded.
Up next, why are Sacramento's levees in such danger of breaking? And what can be done to fix them before it's too late? Is surrounded by aging levees, and experts warn that they are destined to fail. The force of millions of tons of water is just too powerful to contain.
There's two kinds of levees, those that have failed and those that will fail.
And the rapid development in Sacramento around its levees only heightens the potential danger if they fail.
There's been pretty steady progress toward building more and more homes so that we end up with more people at risk of potential flooding at some point.
All this urban growth that's taking place behind the levees is all facing the same fate in the long run.
And Sacramento's levees are known to be in especially bad shape, just as New Orleans' levees were in 2005.
You can see here some of the effects of bank erosion by looking at all the fallen trees. These trees have fallen in because the erosion here has undercut them.
The state of our levees is not good. They're undergoing erosion. We have the most unglamorous problem here of rodents living in our levees and beavers living in our levees, which weaken them.
When the banks of the levees are eroded and weakened, a deadly levee failure becomes much more likely. But since the Katrina tragedy, awareness of the threat is higher than ever.
I think we do have a forewarning now that should accelerate, hopefully, the preparation for the inevitable major flood that will occur in the future.
In 2006, these warnings were taken seriously. Governor Schwarzenegger declared a state of emergency for the levees and asked for $2.5 billion for improvements. If the funds are quickly approved and work is begun, major flooding in California may be averted. It's a race against time. Up next, what are the keys to survival if you are caught in a catastrophic flood? So how can you be ready when the big flood hits? Many flood-prone cities have created extensive inundation maps used to plan evacuation routes.
Once we determine that the levee is in danger, we'll begin a mandatory evacuation. We will then advise people through the emergency alert system, also through other media sources, also through our telephone system. We have a call system where we can call homes and let them know what the evacuation routes are and where the shelters are located. We'll also let them know which routes they cannot take.
If you can't evacuate in time, a kit of emergency response tools can be your best defense to survive the flood.
Prior to the flood, people really should have a disaster kit.
James and Larkin Penrose keep a kit on the second floor of their house.
a radio, lots of batteries, flashlights, a water filtration kit.
It's extremely important to have enough supplies to last several days. At least 3 gallons of water per person, canned food, protective clothing, and important documents in plastic containers.
This is an insurance policy for a home.
You will find people ranging from having small little disaster preparedness kits at home to we've seen people that are sporting their boats.
We don't expect that there will be flooding here, but we also are planning just in case there is.
But thousands remain unprepared.
The problem is conveying this sense of risk. Floods don't happen very often, so people forget about them in between floods.
With a solid evacuation plan and a well-stocked emergency kit, your chances of survival increase dramatically. But it could happen tomorrow.